So the text begins with a warning, beware of. And the Greek word, the root word for beware is blepo, which means to be observant. And not just quick to notice, because the word carries the connotation of seeing something physical that has implications about the spiritual in order for the observer to properly understand and take the needed action. Let me say that again. Blepo, the word for beware, carries the connotation of seeing something physical that has implications about the spiritual in order to properly understand and take needed action. So what do we observe in our text this morning? Well, we see scribes who like to walk around in long robes. And so I guess you could say that means they were focused on external appearance. They wanted to look good. Then we see scribes who wanted to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. And that equals scribes who lack humility. We see scribes who want the best seats in the synagogues and the best places at the feast. We could say that they liked being in the places where they were seen and places where they were honored and praised. Now, since scribes relied heavily on donations for their livelihood, devouring the widows' houses means they were extracting money or other assets from the most vulnerable in the communities to enrich themselves. And then we see scribes who like to pray a long time, long rambling prayers, just so they can be noticed. So that's what we as listeners are asked to observe. And let us not forget that the scribes were the religious experts of the Old Testament law. They hand copied it, they memorized it, they taught it, they wrote about it, they settled disputes about it. They were sort of like the seminary professors and the leading Bible commentators. And beyond that, they also functioned as lawyers and governing leaders. So Jesus wants us to observe and address the spiritual implications of those scribes who focused on external appearances, lacked humility, expected to be exalted and honored, who were to be served but without serving, who enriched themselves at the expenses of others, and whose faithfulness was inauthentic. And it ends, I'm guessing, with the warning that if one makes those kind of choices in living their lives, judgment is anticipated. In the old King James translates condemnation as damnation. So that's our reading for this morning. So what is the spiritual implications for me and for you? Well, for me, I become aware of my tendency to be suspicious of others who don't act consistent with the traits of the fruit of the Spirit, which is, for me, the standard of faithfulness, of living more Christ-like. But it's not just suspicion. Suspicion turns into judgment, and then judgment becomes my means to dismiss them. Now, all this is with good cause in my head, and I'm pretty good with that attitude and that action when they are so obvious with their inauthenticity. I know what the lack of humility looks like. I know what racism sounds like. So I'm okay when it's that obvious, that visible. But when I observe the more subtle contradicting behaviors, particularly of those who I have a relationship with, I become more willing to overlook their the spiritual implications and more generous toward them. So, for you, what are the spiritual implications of this text? When you observe those who focus on external appearances, when you experience people who lack humility or who want to be exalted publicly, who expect to be honored, when you see those who want to be served rather than serving and who's rich themselves at the expense of others, how do you deal with your kind of scribes? So I began to wonder what's in this text. What are we supposed to listen to or for? What is Jesus trying to teach us by drawing our attention to these particular behaviors? What are we to observe? So, what if we made the shift from the scribes' false intention and description and give energy toward discovering new ways for you and me to be less like them and more like Christ? So what if we take Jesus' warning as an invitation to focus us on building up behaviors that are just the opposite of the scribes? So let's translate the last sentence, or this sentence. Jesus taught, he said, beware of the scribes. Jesus taught saying, become aware about how to live a better life. So it begins by not worrying about external appearances. The scribes chose to care about the wrong things. They cared too much about what other people were saying about them. External validation was a motivating factor. And that does not have to be for us. Our focus is on what matters most in your life. Scripture says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So what motivates you to live more faithfully? And again, for the Spirit thing is the standard for me. But once you figure out what matters most to you, your focus becomes clearer, correct? What matters most to you in living out your faithfulness? So what I would suggest is you won't need others to notice you. You won't need external validation, but others will naturally notice you because you'll be shining light on the better way to live. So ponder this day, what motivates you to live more faithfully? Humility becomes the next issue that we deal with, not the lack of humility as much as it is how can you strengthen your humility. And in the Hebrew and the Greek, the word humility means low or lowliness. It's the way that we act toward God and each other. And if you think about it, humility is only visible in how you live your life. Humility will transform behavior. I'll write some of this stuff down because it's good. For me, humility alters my selfishness. It transforms my pride. It changes my sense of entitlement and arrogance. It forces me to realize that I don't have near as much control as I want. And humility makes me listen better. Keeps me from being judgmental. It helps me with asking for forgiveness. It reminds me to be grateful and thankful each and every day. Generous listening will strengthen your humility. So how can you strengthen your humility? It's been said you can't be a servant if you're full of yourself. And that leads us to the next observation, serving others. Where are you serving? Now notice how I phrased the question. It's not if you are to serve, but rather, where are you serving? Because I don't think I have to convince you the importance of serving. Jesus served both the outcasts and the insiders, as well as those who are most vulnerable, the widows and the children, but also the rich and the comfortable. All people mattered to Jesus. And I would say that each of us believes that all people matter. There is a place for everyone at the table. And I would suggest that serving others, helping others, being compassionate toward those in need is core. It's in our heart. And it matters to God that we show compassion and hospitality toward our brothers and sisters and help meet their needs. We are not invited to be served, but rather to serve in response to Jesus' invitation. We also hear about those who like to enrich themselves at the cost of others, forcibly appropriate someone else's assets or money. So our question becomes, what is enriching to you? What makes you better? In whatever season of life we find ourselves, what makes you better? Perhaps it's finishing what you start, appreciating the beauty of nature, learning something new, being good to others, practicing gratitude, spending time with friends and family, singing, writing, sitting. What is enriching to you? And even though there are many in our world who would disagree with me, but no one is ever enriched at the expense of another. Manipulation and schemes at the expense of others are not where we are to aim ourselves. We become enriched when we aim ourselves toward each other. Now comes the time of the long praying. Not that Karen and I pray long, but sometimes we do. Sometimes it seems that it goes on and on and on, but I don't think it's because of false piety. So the question that I pose is not how long your prayers, but rather how are you deepening your piety? And let me suggest that if you're growing in your faith to show others, or if you're sharing your faith to prove something to others, you're not really growing or sharing your faith. We are to build ourselves up into a spiritual house, a holy priesthood. False piety fakes faithfulness. Say that 3 times. False piety fakes faithfulness. And in God's eyes and in the love of Christ, I realize that I am not better than anybody else. And when I come to realize that at the deepest level, I position myself to become much more observant and engaged in what God intends in my life. So, a really quick review. Find what motivates you to live more faithfully. Strengthen your humility. Serve others. Discover what makes you a better person, and observe and engage in what God intends in your life. So let me close by rereading the passage. As Jesus taught, he said, "Observe my beloved of Pine Shores and throughout the world, who care about the right things, who are filled with humility, who serve others rather than needing to be served. They enrich themselves not at the expense of others, but through embodiment of justice. And hear how their prayers reflect their deep trust in God. They will receive the greater praise.